Welcome to The Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was James Vincent McMorrow with From the Woods. And on this week's show, I want to give you a rundown of some of the most recent science news, because I haven't done that for a few weeks. And the first item on my list is something that does in fact have to do with the woods, as you might have guessed from the first song. And specifically, I want to think about a creature that lives in the woods, and that is the wood cockroach. Now, when I say the word cockroach, you probably automatically have some negative responses. And in some cases, I guess that does make sense, because cockroaches can be quite dirty little animals that are found in kind of yucky spaces where bad things collect, and that actually is exactly what this research is about. So, researchers have recently found that wood cockroaches constantly poo in their nests, and that this may actually have an evolutionary benefit. Now, this sounds like a really unsanitary thing to do. We, of course, would never go around filling our homes with our own excreta, and certainly we know that there are some horror stories from the Victorian times, for example, where people would actually die when they went down in to clean out the sewers and to clean out the outhouses. So actually, poo can be very dangerous to have around in large enough amounts. But for the cockroaches, it actually can be beneficial. So their nests are found inside decayed wood, and the cockroaches live there in family units. And decayed wood, as you might expect, has pretty high levels of microbes. And of course, that has to do with the fact that, you have to have things that are able to decay wood. And it turns out that microbes are very good at doing that. And that once that process begins, it fosters a habitat that is good for more microbes to come in and prey on the ones that were there before, or to eat other things that are there in that habitat. And whatever the case might be, you just basically end up with all of these organisms that can, in fact, be harmful both to insects and to bigger critters like us. So, in fact, the microbes in question that are quite interesting here are the ones that can cause infections and have other negative impacts on these cockroaches. Now, researchers wondered whether the microbes might be kept at bay by the cockroach poo. Maybe that is why this particular behavior has evolved, because somehow by pooing in the nest, the cockroaches can make the area safer for themselves. So to test this experimentally, the scientists collected something called conidia, and they collected the conidia from entomopathogenic fungi, a specific species, in fact, called Metarhizium anisopliae. Now, conidia are the asexual, non-motile spores of a fungus. So they're genetically identical to the parent, and they develop into new organisms. So they're kind of like little clones. And entomopathogenic fungi, as you might expect if you know a little bit of your roots, are fungi that are harmful to insects. And this particular species that they looked at is a soil fungus that is found actually very widespread all around the world. And it can cause diseases in a variety of insects by acting as a parasitoid. And the disease that it causes is often known as green muscardine disease, and it gets its name from the fact that the spores are greenish in color. So what happens when this disease permeates the cockroach colonies is that the conidia will come into contact with a potential insect host. In this case, we are talking about cockroaches, but it can impact other insects and other little creepy crawlies as well. So it will come into contact, germinate, and produce hyphae. And hyphae are long and branching filaments that can pierce through the cuticle, or the outer shell, if you like, the outer covering of the insects. The fungus will then develop inside the body and produce something called a destruxin. And that, as you might guess from the name of it, is something that is, in fact, quite harmful and destructive to the insects. These are little peptides that will basically kill off the insects within a few days. And the cadaver will turn first red and then white with mold and then finally green as all of the spores are produced to go off and start the process all over again. So this is quite an unpleasant thing for the insect itself to experience. And the researchers wanted to look at what happened if they were to collect some of these samples and incubate them with, well, basically incubate them either with or without the fecal samples. So what they did was crush up a bunch of collected poo samples from the cockroaches and grow up conidia that had been incubated with those samples on agar plates. And then they also did the same type of growing up on the agar plates with conidia that had not had any contact with the cockroach poo to begin with. So what they found was that incubation with The fecal samples led to reduced viability of the conidia, so in other words, having the poo present meant that the fungus was not able to grow. And what they also found was that longer incubation times led to increased reductions in viability. So the longer the fungal spores were in contact with the poo, the more likely that the poo was going to have a negative effect, and the stronger that effect was. And at first, the researchers thought that this might be related to the activity of something known as beta-1,3-glucanase. And this is an enzyme that is found in quite large numbers in the cockroach hindgut. However, they did some further work and they found that actually the antifungicidal activity, so the whatever it was, the property of the poo that was having a negative impact on the conidia, was actually related to something that was sensitive to heat, something other than that enzyme that was found in the cockroach poo and was sensitive to heat. And they knew that it was sensitive to heat because they boiled the fecal samples and they also subjected them to UV radiation, and they found that both of these treatments rendered the antifungicidal properties negative, basically. It removed that ability of the poo to have any impact on the fungus. Now, they still aren't really sure what it was exactly about the poo that had this negative impact on the conidia, but they suspect that it has to do something with the chemical processes that the fungus needs to go through in order to get from one stage of growth to the next. And what's most likely happening is that some chemical or other in the poo is disrupting the chemical processes of the fungus. And of course that is going to need to be tested with some sort of a future research project, but this is kind of where they are now. So they know that the poo does have an effect. They know that this probably has kind of an evolutionary benefit, and so now they just need to go forward and get some more specifics. Now you might think that actually this is a bit of a random thing to study. It's a bit kind of esoteric. How are you ever going to use this? Well, in addition to providing kind of specific information about this one species of cockroach, the study may also help explain sociality in insects in general, and in particular groups of insects that are other cockroaches and also relatives of cockroaches. So for example, both wood cockroaches and termites have a shared ancestor, and both are very social insects. So all these guys are living and nesting in environments that have lots of fungi and other microbes. So the evolution of this poo, where it's able to kill off these things that are dangerous, in combination with a tendency to live in groups, could have helped these insects survive rather than succumb to mycosis or infection with fungi. So it could be that the ability of the poo to do this and the ability of large amounts of poo, which only would be produced by lots and lots of these guys living together in a single place, kind of helped shape the social systems found in these insects. Now, of course, we don't know for sure which of these things actually happened first. They could have been social and then developed the poo. They could have had this special poo and then become more social, and we're not really sure. It could have happened at the same time, both of these things kind of evolving together. So again, more comparative work, more specific research might allow us to get more information on this and really understand the system in a bit more detail. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Good Vibrations by Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. And on this week's show, I am talking about some recent science headlines, things that have made the news, and you might not have heard about these because they're a bit more, kind of low-key scientific findings, but interesting nonetheless. And the next one up on my list is a finding about animals and music. So researchers from a variety of fields have long been interested in how, why, and when animals developed an appreciation for and an interest in music, or things that we can kind of relate to as kind of musical behaviors. And this might be the production of vocalizations, or the movement in a kind of rhythmic pattern, or potentially making kind of percussive sounds using a branch or a rock. So anything like that that we might perceive as music, and that the animals might be doing in some sort of a musical fashion. And music often is kind of considered something that, we don't have to do it. It's a behavior that's kind of in excess of what we need in order to communicate. So this is what you would expect to find in these animals as well. So it's kind of like any other art where it's kind of above and beyond what you need in order to get through basic social functions. So do we see this in other animals? And if we do, why and when did they first develop that sort of behavior? Well, a recent preliminary study looking at animals that are held in captivity in a zoo in Florida has suggested that a very close relative of humans, the bonobo, does have rhythm that's not entirely unlike ours. So bonobos were already known to be highly attuned to sound and to have even better hearing than humans over at least part of our hearing range. So this sets them up to be able to hear and appreciate things that might be kind of musical in nature. And other previous work has also shown that they appear to prefer a tempo of about 280 beats per minute. And interestingly, this is about the same rhythm at which humans use when they're speaking syllables in everyday language. Now, biomusicians and psychologists in this current study developed what they refer to as a bonobo-friendly drum. Basically, this is a really big drum that they could put in the enclosure of the bonobos in the zoo, and it's quite resonant, so it makes a really nice, loud, very audible sound, and it's also really durable, so it can withstand all the stuff that the bonobos might do to it, whether they are actually trying to make music, as they might call it, or as we might call it, or whether they're just kind of playing around on it because it's a thing that's there and it's interesting. So they made sure that it could withstand being jumped on and chewed and hit and all sorts of stuff. And what they did during experiments with this instrument and these animals was that the researchers played a drum that they had for themselves. They played it at that bonobo-friendly 280 beats per minute and then watched to see what the bonobos did, if anything, with their own drum. And what they found is that when they started playing their human drum, the bonobos would respond by playing. And in fact, not only were they were playing at the same rhythm that the humans were using. So this seemed to be indicative of the fact that, if nothing else, they could at least appreciate a certain rhythm and kind of think about it and then turn around and produce it themselves, which indicates kind of a certain amount of musicality. So again, it isn't really necessarily music per se, but it does indicate that the animals have an innate rhythmic ability, to quote the researchers. And that is quite an interesting and important thing to find, because this suggests that maybe it is something that they are born with and something that then they might share with other kind of close animals in the family tree. So it might be something that is familiar across all primates, for example. Now, in other previous studies, comparative psychologists have also noted that animals that don't have this sort of innate shared ability, so things like sea lions, for example, are still capable of learning how to move in time to music. And this is kind of an interesting thing because it suggests that there are two routes to maybe approaching music. So there's the stuff that you can learn, and there's the stuff that you might be born with. And maybe in order to be able to learn it, you have to have some other innate quality that allows you to do that. And maybe that innate quality is kind of the basis of the other innate stuff of actually producing the rhythm. Who knows? This all could be very complex, and it all could involve kind of a suite of genes or different genes that are completely unrelated and happen to contribute, or maybe it all comes down to one single gene, which is quite rare, but you never know. So all this stuff is kind of beginning to paint a picture of where rhythm comes in and where music comes in to the lives of different animals. And many people suspect that both musical and rhythmic abilities of humans are associated with social bonds, because being able to be musical and appreciate music and do things associated with music, so for example singing in large groups or dancing together, all of this can strengthen interactions between people and also between groups of people that kind of share these cultural things in common. So if this is true, then, as I kind of mentioned earlier, some shared ancestor of humans and other animals might have possessed these talents, or some fledgling version of these talents, and so they might not have just emerged in humans. This might be something that is basal to some other ancestor before us, which is why both bonobos and humans, and maybe other species as well, show this ability to respond to a rhythm. And of course this raises the question of which ancestor is this? How far back did that ancestor live? Is it more recent, so it's close to the human-bonobo split, or is it even further back than that, so maybe prior to the split between primates and other animals like the sea lion, for example, that display some sort of capacity, but maybe they aren't as rhythmic or as musical as we are. So to further explore this, the researchers, of course, would have to study more species in order to kind of look across the animal kingdom and determine how widespread rhythmic behavior is. And you might think, of course, that birds would be really interesting because they are often considered the most musical of animals, and we do know that many birds both sing and kind of dance while they're performing. So this suggests that maybe those animals do have quite a lot of rhythmic and musical capacity. But again, for this to really be an informative study, you'd have to do this across not just birds and primates, but all sorts of different things to see the full range of behaviors that are out there in the animal kingdom. And for bonobos, they do want to kind of focus in and get a little more detail on this specific species as well. And the researchers are particularly interested in taking this current finding out into the wild. So as I said at the beginning, these guys are all captive. They're in the zoo. And the researchers think that maybe if you were to take this kind of experiment into the wild, the animals might react differently. Or you might be able to find them in kind of different social settings that can't be found in a zoo habitat. So you could look at whether the wild animals are synchronizing with other members of their species. And they do things like beating on hollow trees and doing other percussive behaviors, beating on their chests maybe. So when they're doing those sorts of things, are they kind of doing it to a certain rhythm that's common across all of those examples of behavior? Do they start to do it in time with someone else that's doing it at the same time? Is there any kind of shared capacity to do this sort of thing in a certain way? And if so, is that relevant? Are they doing it in order to communicate something, or is it just happen to be something that they do? For example, we know that in birds, when birds are singing, there is an upper limit and probably even a lower limit to how fast they're able to do something. And this has to do purely with kind of the physical mechanics. So if you've got a bill of a certain size, you're only going to be able to move it so fast. So it could be that maybe bonobos do a certain rhythm time and time again, but they're doing it because that's comfortable given the size of their arms and the strength of their muscles. And it may not have anything to do with actually communicating by using that particular pattern. And this is all stuff that they could begin to get at if they repeated this research and did it out in the wild in a number of different bonobo groups and in a number of different settings. Now the next piece of news that I want to talk about completely is on a different topic, so we're switching gears here. And this is returning actually to a topic that I have discussed a little bit in the past on this show, which is the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And the reason that this has made the news again is that researchers from a variety of different institutions, both government and academic, have found that tuna may have suffered heart damage as a result of being exposed to the chemicals that were released whenever the crude oil was bubbling up into the sea after the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And the tuna in question here are both bluefin and yellowfin tuna, which use the Gulf of Mexico as a really important spawning ground. And tracking data from the area indicate that actually there were probably lots of these animals in the area when the oil spill first occurred in 2010. And of course, the spill left residues that were there for a while, so actually it's not just the animals that were there during the event that were likely impacted, but also those that came and went afterwards before the cleanup was really effective. So there could be lots of different species and lots of different individuals that were impacted. And of course tuna are particularly problematic because these guys are already having some population issues because of overfishing. So it's really important to have really healthy fisheries for these guys and have really healthy spawning grounds, otherwise their populations could decline even further. And that's why this new news is quite alarming. And previous research has shown that the oil contains chemicals that are harmful to, in particular, the tuna young, so embryonic fish and developing fish. And this includes in particular something called polyaromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. And PAHs can slow down the heart, cause arrhythmias, and even lead to heart attacks if they are, if the fish are exposed to them in high enough levels. And the studies that provided these details illuminated the effects of PAHs, and researchers have known this kind of stuff for years, but they didn't understand the mechanisms by which they impacted the fish. So they weren't really sure, knowing that PAHs are bad, what are the circumstances in which this bad effect is likely to occur? How many chemicals need to be in the water? What age groups exactly are going to be impacted? Is it just the young, or is it all of them? Which things are going to be most susceptible? Is there any way to kind of counteract this effect. So they didn't know any of these details because they didn't understand on a molecular level exactly what was going on between the chemicals and the organisms. And that is what this new research has done. And they've done the new stuff in a laboratory setting because they needed to kind of artificially expose these cells and these groups of cells to the chemicals in order to understand exactly what's happening, in order to look at that on a molecular level underneath a microscope. And so what they found is that the PAHs appear to block the cellular pathways that are used for the movement of potassium and calcium ions in and out of the cells. And if you know much about kind of basic biology, you know that these are really fundamental signaling molecules that start and stop a lot of things in the body. So basically these ion channels will open and let those things in or out, and that will cause kind of a cascade of events that tells the body what to do at a given time. And one of these cascading events is, well, it's a couple of different events that are tied in together in getting the heart to beat on a regular basis. So if you disrupt that process, obviously it's not going to be very good for an animal that needs regular heartbeat and regular blood flow in order to keep oxygen going and keep nutrients flowing in the blood around the body. So whenever this particular pathway is disrupted, or these pathways in general, they can reduce the functioning of the heart, and the heart is not effective, and this can have huge consequences because obviously the heart is kind of fundamental to things, and it's not just like you're going to cause an arrhythmia and that's going to be kind of uncomfortable. This actually could have sequential effects on other parts of the body as well if it goes on for too long. And what they found specifically was that when they treated these cells with oil, they were reacting more slowly to stimulation and not producing contractions that were as strong as those that were observed in healthy cells. So again, they're finding kind of what they found before, but in a very molecularly specific way, that it's slowing down the heart and it's not allowing the cells to be as responsive in that excitation-contraction coupling event that happens to give us the heartbeat that we have. And I say us because all other vertebrates share a common ancestor with fish, so the patterns that are seen in the fish are probably true for other species as well, including even humans, because we all have very similar systems of heart beating. And this is particularly true because these pathways, not just the heart in general, but these specific pathways are among the most conserved pathways across all animals. So from one ancestor to the next, we see this thing being passed down generation after generation in all different species. So it's a very evolutionarily important feature that's basic to our existence, and it's really bad that the chemicals are interfering with that. Now, of course, the reason that all of this is kind of a dire finding is that there were lots of other animals that were swimming in the oil near the platform and in the residues that kind of emanated away from the platform and were found elsewhere. So I mentioned before on the show that these things were also found near the shore. They have found plumes that travel underwater and go quite a long distance elsewhere, so they are still on the bottom of the sea and they're just sitting there waiting to be kind of kicked up again and into the waves so they can be transported elsewhere. So all these chemicals are still out there. They were still out there for a while things were swimming about. So that's lots of different organisms that could be and still might be in the future impacted by these chemicals. And the oil petroleum products in general are not just a problem in the water. So this is an important finding for thinking about the implications of Deepwater Horizon and cleaning that up and maybe kind of trying to refigure just how many species and individuals were impacted by it, because we still don't necessarily have accurate figures on how many organisms were killed off or damaged by the spill. But also you can kind of extrapolate that and think about other places in which petroleum is present and other places where similar contamination might occur. And what's really scary is that some of the other places are, near us. So car exhaust is a petroleum product. Petroleum factories have fumes, and it's possible that these same chemicals are being released from those sources and from other sources as well in anthropogenic habitats. And it could be that these sorts of things that are out in the air, out in smog, for example, are responsible for the high levels of cardiac morbidity, so deaths related to heart problems, that are observed in people who live in areas with lots of air pollution. So this might help explain some of these patterns that we've seen in humans and not really been able to understand in the past. And of course this would be Yet another reason why we'd be really interested in moving away from these petroleum products and trying to find a cleaner source of fuel instead. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Chris Isaak with Go Walking Down There. And on today's show, I am talking about some recent science events that have made the news and that you maybe haven't heard of yet. And the next article that I want to discuss is something that I actually tweeted today and has gotten lots of interest from the people that follow me, because people love orangutans, and that's what this one is about. They love primates, I guess, in general, and this kind of has a behavioral aspect to it and also a conservation aspect, so it's got a little bit for everyone. So this particular study is one that was conducted over 7 years, so it's got quite a lot of data, and it looked at orangutans that were living in Borneo, and specifically it was interested in looking at their behaviors and using camera traps to see how often they're doing various things. And I'm sure that actually these researchers were looking at lots and lots of different behaviors, but the particular paper that they've published just now is one that looks at how often they come down out of the trees and how much they spend time on the ground. And this is quite an interesting thing because they are mainly arboreal. They are the largest arboreal animals in the world. And so we don't tend to think of them really as being very terrestrial and spending much time on the ground. So it's quite an interesting thing to think about. And it's also interesting to think about if they are doing this more than we thought, why is it that they're doing it? Does it have something to do with us? Is it just something that they do naturally? What exactly is the basis of this behavior? So that's why they've deployed all of these different camera traps, and they had 16 different kind of major sites, but then they also had 1,409 different points distributed across those sites where they put out camera traps. And they did this over a total number of days, 150,000 basically, so they had quite a substantive process of going out and deploying these things in, thick jungle. This is quite a research undertaking. And after all that time, the cameras collected 641 images, which just goes to show you that even though they have spent all this time trying to collect the images, that actually is not that high a number given how long the cameras were out. So it really isn't that common that the orangutans were coming down and using the ground. So as I said, these guys are the largest arboreal mammal, mostly seen up in the trees. And when they do come down, it previously has been kind of associated with habitat disturbance. So there was kind of an inkling among scientists and among conservationists that the reason that they go to ground has something to do with traveling around more quickly, or maybe moving from one patch to the other, maybe looking for food, where it's, you've kind of come to the end of a certain patch of trees and you're not finding any more, so you need to go elsewhere. And what they have found in this current study is that indeed the likelihood of finding an orangutan on the ground has to do with forest loss and fragmentation. And this, of course, is increasingly common in orangutan habitat. Unfortunately, these guys are very threatened because there is so much habitat destruction going on for things like palm oil plantations, for example. So they're really starting to run out of space and feel a lot of pressure on their habitat. And what they found here is that terrestriality was influenced by both the degree of forest disturbance and also the amount of gap between one patch of canopy and the next. So if you've got a canopy that doesn't have lots of leaves and lots of branches and it's just kind of a wide open space, probably because lots of trees have been cut down, then the orangutans are more likely to come down. However, one of the interesting things was, even though they did tie this behavior in with the amount of patchiness that was caused, predominantly by human behaviors, they did also found that orangutans in completely natural areas were down on the ground as much as the orangutans in the heavily human disturbed areas. So this suggests that actually, even though they are doing this more often in places where humans have gone in and kind of removed trees or removed whole patches of forest, they do still do it on their own. So there must be some sort of an evolutionary interest in this type of behavior. It is something that is adaptive and useful to them, and they've done it all along, even before we got in there. They also found that all age and sex classes were recorded on the ground, but flanged males, which are the males that have those crazy cheek pads and throat pouches, You might have seen pictures of these because they're really cute when they're young, and then the males get to a certain age and they develop these features, and they're not nearly as cute. They're very threatening. And this actually indicates males that are older, so they're at least 15 years old when they develop that, and they are capable of reproduction. So that's the time at which their testicles descend and they're able to actually reproduce. So the flanged males are the ones that, of course, would be more interested in sex, and possibly more interested also in kind of defeating or showing off to potential rivals. So this suggests that possibly these terrestrial movements are somehow associated with interacting with those potential mates or those potential rivals, or have some other thing to do with reproduction in general. And the fact that orangutans were found on the ground fairly frequently suggests that actually they may have a greater capacity than once realized to deal with all this fragmentation that's happening in their habitats. And it's encouraging that they do this in natural areas, because it shows that they're comfortable with this sort of behavior. They don't automatically avoid it. And the fact that they do it quite often, specifically in those human disturbed areas, shows that they seem to kind of use it as a way of maybe coping in those habitats. So this is particularly good because there are lots of places where fragmentation kind of leads to these mosaic-style landscapes where you've got a mixture of habitat types and land use types. And so if the orangutans get to the edge of a forest patch and suddenly find themselves next to a farm or a small town or something completely different, this observation of all of these cameras suggests that actually they're going to be quite happy to just walk a bit of a distance to the next forest and then climb back up into the trees. However, the researchers do also say that it's not likely that this is going to be happening a whole lot in places where you've got massive gaps between patches or between trees. Where this is really going to work is where the fragmentation is relatively small scale, or where the mosaics have kind of a high percentage of canopy mixed in with other types of habitat use as well. So of course they need to study this in a bit more detail to find out if there is one particular mix that works better than another. But the other thing is they'd also need to know a bit more about how the orangutans are moving. So the cameras would have just gotten them, a brief little snapshot as they walk past. What they don't know is how long do they take, where are they going, do they kind of stick to the shadows, or do they just go right out in the open? All those sorts of things about the method of the movement, they're not really known yet. And another thing that the scientists also point out is that even though it might be beneficial for the orangutans to move between habitat patches and access different areas of resources, the behavior could also have drawbacks. So it sounds really good at first because you think, oh, they're totally adapting to the humans. That means they can go and get food and find shelter and all those other things. But when they're out in the open, they're more likely to run into humans, and they do tend to be highly persecuted by humans. And another thing that's interesting about that is that they do tend to be very quiet when they're on the ground, but they're much louder up in the canopy. And so, you can kind of argue about whether it's good or bad to be quiet or loud in those various spaces, because a human that rounds the corner and sees an orangutan, which is actually quite a large animal, might respond quite negatively because it looks much more threatening on the ground, and there it is, it was all quiet, and suddenly up in your face, and you might be more likely to attack it. So who knows? So that could be a danger. Another danger might be susceptibility to predation by other animals, and this is particularly true for the young. So the adults are quite large and probably not in as much danger, but the young could be eaten by dogs and other predators. And also, all of this movement could be bad in terms of diseases. So I've spoken on the show in the past about how habitat disturbance and changes in land use can facilitate the spread of disease, because it means that things are moving in different ways, they're interacting with different species, they're being exposed to novel pathogens. So all of this could actually mean that the orangutans are going to be more likely to pick up something that could do them a lot of harm, especially if they've not ever been exposed to it in the past. So clearly all of this is really interesting to find out this new thing about orangutans that we didn't know before, but it's really just the beginning, and we need to improve our understanding of when and why the animals are taking to the ground, how this influences their dispersal and their movement over the long term, what impacts it has on their survival rates, and whether this means something for our conservation policies, whether we maybe need to rethink what they are and make some adjustments to take into account this different behavior. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was the Black Keys with I Cry Alone. Now the next story, also the final story of the day, is one that I'm quite pleased to be able to share with you because this is actually the result of a study that was conducted by a friend of mine from the U.S. And he does really great work, and this story has been covered all over the place, so it's gotten tons of press. And I'm very pleased for him, so I wanted to hop on the wagon and be another person that's out there talking about the results of his particular research project. And what he looked at is why stinky animals live alone. So he is a mammologist and also an evolutionary biologist, and what he wanted to do was think about why it is that we have animals like skunks, for example, that smell really horrendous whenever they release that kind of smell weaponry that they have. Why it is that we never see them living in groups. And when you pose that question, it sounds like the obvious answer is that they smell bad and they don't want to smell each other, and so of course they stay apart. But actually, the analysis here suggests that it's much more interesting than that. There's a totally different reason why these animals tend to be loners. And this study looked at 181 different carnivorous mammal species, and this includes species like stink badgers and grison and zorillas and skunks and all of these things that projectile spray a stinky substance in order to get rid of things like predators and any other thing that might kind of attack them in an unwanted way. So none of these animals live in social groups like the other animals that were included in the analysis, things like otters and hyenas and foxes and all those things you can think of that tend to be fairly social all the way up to highly social. And one of the interesting things about this pattern, this distinction between whether or not you have the noxious weaponry and whether or not you're social, is the fact that we know that noxious weaponry evolved separately multiple different times in land animals. And the shared ancestor of these guys is quite distant, and yet all of them have the same kind of thing that they use, the stinky spray, and also this tendency to live alone. So why is it that these completely unrelated things have developed both of these characteristics multiple times throughout evolutionary history? It's quite an interesting trend and suggests that there is a reason why those two traits would be seen time and time again together. So one of the possibilities is that it has something to do with the other traits that these guys share. So for example, they all have a tendency towards being nocturnal. And this could be related to the fact that stinky animals are at greatest risk from other nocturnal animals. So things like, a skunk, for example, might be predated by, or evolutionarily have been predated by, a coyote or a cat or a wolf. So things that are found out in the evening or in the dusk or, overnight. So this is not at all true of things that are diurnal, which tend to be at greatest risk from large predatory birds, so things like eagles and very large hawks. So this means that the diurnal, non-stinky animals might have evolved their social behaviors because by hanging out together with friends, close relatives, in your little social groups, you can all keep your eye out and look for these things, these big birds and whatever other predator is coming to get you, and then work together in order to respond accordingly. So sometimes that means your response might be to see it coming and then escape, or if it does attack you, to work together to chase it off and injure it and get it to go away. Whatever the case might be, it helps you to have your friends there on standby to pitch in whenever you need. On the other hand, animals that are likely to be ambushed at night, it's not going to be very useful for them to have other pairs of eyes around because you're all going to be equally blind, basically, in the dark. You're going to be just as susceptible as your friend over there because these things that are hunting you are nocturnal animals that are very quiet, they're not going to be detectable, and they're just going to sneak up on you with speed and stealth, and it's not going to be very useful to have lots of eyes looking for them. However, what would be useful is if you had a type of defense that you could use immediately as soon as you're surprised by this predator and whenever it's in close range. And that's exactly what we find in terms of this scent-based weaponry that we see in these types of animals. It would be really effective against nocturnal predators, particularly that are using smell to hunt. So again, these things like large cats and canids and other animals that are using stealth, they're using an ambush, and they need their nose in order to do that. So in other words, what all this means is that spraying animals likely aren't avoiding each other because they smell bad, but because both sociality and spraying appear to be two entirely different solutions to the problem of the same problem of having a predator out to get you. So you either need one or the other, and you don't need both. Because if you have the group with you, or if you have the scent, you can help avoid being eaten. And it's redundant to have both of those things together. However, it's also important to note that smell isn't the only interesting thing about these animals, and it's not the only tool that they use to avoid being eaten. So they also use things like their interesting coloration. So again, to use the example of skunks, they have that black and white pattern that's really obvious and quite flashy, particularly easy to see in the dark because, of course, the white is really bright and stands out. They have some interesting vocalizations. They also have physical displays. So one of the skunks, for example, in the U.S., it will stand up on its front paws and projectile spray with its butt up in the air. Now, why does it do that instead of standing on all fours and just raising its tail? Who knows? But obviously there's some reason why that particular method of deployment has evolved. So they do lots of other interesting things. And all of these are now being studied in more detail by my friend and his other fellow researchers to try to see how these things might also play a role in this kind of divergent evolution, basically, of these anti-predator behaviors. So that brings me to the end of today's rundown on recent science news, and I'm going to end up with a song by Caro. I'm going to leave you with her singing A Night Like This, and I will talk to you next week.